Hello friends, for today's video I'm going to be chatting about 3 different new fantasy releases. The 3 books I'll be going through would be A Wizard's Guide to Surviving, A Frugal Wizard's Guide to Surviving Medieval England, The Magician's Daughter. I feel like I should just start this over. Hello friends, for today I'm going to be chatting through 3 new fantasy releases. A Frugal Wizard's Guide to Surviving Medieval England, The Magician's Daughter, and Engines of Chaos. There, I did it. I did an entire in-depth discussion spoiler chat with some friends of mine for Sanderson's Secret Project 2, I'll just call it that. And if you've already watched that and you don't really need to hear about it anymore, I'll have a timestamp so you can skip ahead to when I start discussing those other 2 books. But for those of you that do want to hear more about this one, it's the one I'm going to start with. So, jumping into it, this was probably my second least favorite thing by Sanderson I have picked up. And I think a big reason is that so many of us, when we go into Sanderson books, we have certain expectations. We generally find we get really cool magic systems. We tend to get really, really creative worlds, and not just worlds with the settings themselves, but the culture within those worlds, the plant life. There's just so many things that he tends to spend so much time and care into. The architecture of the buildings, the culture of the characters, the animals. So with this, it was very different because this is actually more science fiction, historical fiction. And the reason is there is this technological advancement that has allowed people to go into different dimensions. And a lot of these different dimensions end up being very similar to certain time periods within our own world. And the one that our main character finds himself in is very similar to medieval England. And I do think that if you're going into it expecting it to feel like a lot of the kinds of medieval England-esque fantasy books that you usually get, it didn't really feel like that. It's kind of zeroing in on a certain time period that's a little bit more Norse. And the people that he ends up encountering, the main character, feel more like Vikings, and it feels more Celtic in nature, I guess. So it seemed odd to call it medieval England because I think even that provides certain expectations that aren't necessarily going to be met. And because it's a different dimension, it's not exactly the same. But regardless, it was kind of a character from our own time, what feels like time traveling back in time with just some details tweaked and changed about the dimension that he's in. And our main character, it has that effect of when he first wakes up in the story, he has no idea where he is or what's going on or even who he is. And this is called a White Room story. That's what Sanderson calls it, similar to something like The Bourne Identity. And I don't find I'm 100% opposed to this setup for a story. However, I did find that the main character was kind of annoying. And so it wasn't my favorite to be like, I don't know anything about you, you don't know anything about you, but what I do know about you isn't great. And as he was discovering more about himself, that's kind of one of the things that you dive into as you are reading through the story. You start to know more about him, and as he's having these realizations of who he is, he's almost having a breakdown about everything. And so you're seeing a person almost have a second chance to sort of start fresh by being in this new dimension. And the reason that the story is called A Frugal Wizard's Guide is because you get the guidebook's information delivered to you periodically as you're reading through the story. Some of my friends mentioned that this is not a new thing. You get this with a fair amount of other stories. And a lot of the elements of this book were derivative sounds really negative in nature, but it wasn't Sanderson's signature uniqueness. So it felt familiar in a lot of ways, but I wouldn't say that it really reinvented the wheel or did anything that is transforming these kinds of tropes or this sort of subgenre within science fiction. So overall, it was just a little bit underwhelming. But I do think that because of the comp titles, things like Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, and some of the other ones that you could say this is similar to, I actually could see this being fun for people that like really, really accessible, fun science fiction stories. And having stories that you just fly through. I also felt like the tone itself It leaned more, in my opinion, towards young adult. Some of the themes definitely are things that I think adults can connect with, but I do think that the tone and the way that characters react to certain things, the way their behavior is in general, it felt very juvenile at times, which is, I think, fine. If this were to be sold traditionally, I would expect to find it in the young adult section. So it was kind of a weird combination of a lot of things, and it was also not certain things that I had thought it would be or was expecting it to be, which I think is why we're seeing, in talking to my friends, I discovered that it would seem to be the general consensus that this is not really too many people's favorite Sanderson book, but it is a mix of things. So there's a lot of things in there for people to not love. There's also, of course, on the flip side, a lot of things that you might end up liking. Wasn't my favorite, but it was not the worst ever either. What was amazing are both of the next two books, and so I'm going to start with Engines of Chaos. This is a sequel, so I can't say too much in the realm of specifics for this one. It is a sequel to Engines of Empire, and oh my gosh, I need more people to read this series. I really, truly do. So when I read Engines of Empire. Gosh, I always do that. I always mix up which one's first. When I read the first book in this series, I was like, what the heck? This is so good. What is going on? You know when you get into something and there's no hype for it and nobody's talking about it and you're like, what is happening? Why is that the reality? This needs to be, and you start to then question, especially after you've read the book. You're like, was it good? Because no one else is talking about it. So maybe it wasn't. I don't know. And that's okay. I had this weird fear. I do this sometimes whenever I find something that's not that hyped, there's not a whole lot of buzz about it, and if I pick it up and I love it, and it's the first in a series, then when the second one comes around, I have this fear for some reason that I imagined it all, that it's just all in my head that it was good, and I'm going to pick up the sequel and be like, oh no, this is not good at all. And that was not the case. I was so relieved when I picked up this book because I'm like, oh yeah, no, this is good. This is epic fantasy done so well. I think this is the most underhyped. This might be the most underhyped new release right now that I've experienced with fantasy. And obviously this is a sequel, so this is even more underhyped. But the first one, just if you like epic fantasy, pick up the series. That's all you need to know, is that it's amazing and it's epic fantasy. That's probably not all you need to know. I'll give you some more details. So the story follows the Hawksburg Guild, which is made up of this family. We have the matriarch, the mother, and her 3 children, and they're all adults, so they all have their own perspectives and plot lines, as does the matriarch of the family. And those are the 4 main perspectives. There is a 5th that is also very significant. There's a plane flying overhead. I'm just going to keep going. There's a 5th perspective that every time I talk about the series, I say, I'm not going to tell you any details about the 5th perspective because I think it's so much more interesting when you don't know who this perspective is going to be. And then when you do get this perspective, based off of what you've been hearing from the other perspectives, when you do get this one, you're like, oh, this is different. And this is providing a little bit more, I don't know what word I'm looking for. It just makes things more exciting and intriguing. It's more intriguing. It provides some intrigue into the story. So it shifts your perspective a little bit. And a lot of the book is the shifting of perspectives because for a long time, you're following these characters, you relatively like them. They're the kind of characters that they're definitely flawed. They feel like real people. And some of them, they're hot-headed, or some of them seem to be a little bit naive or blinded by their love for a certain person, or the fact that they're related to a certain person, or this is the way of life. This is how it's always been. What do you mean that people are opposed to this? So you are following them, and thus you relatively like them. You are seeing the world through how they see the world. But then the further into the story you get, the more that things sort of change and your eyes are opened, and it's exciting. It is definitely the kind of fantasy story where you do not have the limits of the magic mapped out for you. The rules and limitations are not extremely clear. And when I first talked about Engines of Empire, I talked about how it reminds me so much. And I know this is an overused comparison, and I pretty much never actually compare things to Game of Thrones, but I haven't come across a story that is more like Game of Thrones that I can think of. If you like Game of Thrones, and I'm saying Game of Thrones because I've only watched the show. I'm waiting for the next book to come out, and then I will start the books, but that's probably never gonna happen. So anyway, I legitimately mean Game of Thrones, not A Song of Ice and Fire. But if you like the books or the show, I can't speak for the books. If you like the show, if you like the story, Engines of Empire is going to fill that role. I get so tired of people making that comparison, but truly, and I'll give some examples. Some of the character types they're, like I was saying before, they're flawed. Some of them are rather villainous. Some of them are, especially in the sequel, you get characters that are not they were villainous in nature, but then you start to get their perspectives and you're seeing them change, and then suddenly you kind of start to like them. But you also see characters that are at odds with our main characters, and then you're like, well, who do I root for? And similarly to how you have the Starks and the Lannisters in Game of Thrones, you have the Hawksbury Guild, and especially in the sequel, you start to get the other guilds, which had that similar dynamic of these powerhouse families. You have one family that's more so responsible for certain kinds of the things that they use for their technological advancements, and certain things that are more so tied to the magic, and certain things that are more tied to agriculture. And so you have these guilds that have a lot of prowess within their politics and within their country as a result of different things that bring them a lot of money and wealth. So it was that, but on top of all of that, I also just think the twists throughout the story, the reveals, the fact that characters actually die in this series, and the what the heck just happened, I don't know, but I don't really care. I'm still here for the ride. That's how I felt about this. And similarly, to keep going on that comparison to Game of Thrones, when I say that you don't always know what's going on, you know how in Game of Thrones, randomly some person who is of a certain religion will be like, I just brought somebody back to life. And you're like, what? That is possible here? Or somebody births a demon baby. Somebody will birth a demon baby. And you're like, I guess they can do that here. And you don't really know the details, but you're like, whoa. And you just go with it. This series does that too. And it's done in a way that I like. I think that's really hard to do, but this series does it very well. And as far as the sequel goes, in comparison to the first book, like I said, you get more perspectives, which I liked. The animosity between the guilds and between religious leaders and such things is built upon. And I don't know where this series is going. And I really like not knowing where this is going. By the end of it, I was like, dude, what the heck? I need the sequel now. I need the third book now. And I don't have it. So in the meantime, I'm just going to shout at all of you to consider picking it up if it sounds interesting, because it is so good. Anyway, last for today, we have another book that I thought was great. This one was delightful, and that would be The Magician's Daughter. Very different from both of the previous two books I've mentioned. The Magician's Daughter is a story that follows a young woman who has grown up fairly isolated. The only people that she has in her life are her guardian, who raised her essentially as his own daughter, and he's a magician, and then his familiar, which is a bunny, and it can turn into a person, but it prefers being a bunny. And I'm sorry to say it like that, it's just bunnies are really cute. And side tangent for a second, not tangent, but just a little story time. Whenever my husband and I go on little nature walks, we live in Arizona, we like to count the amount of cottontails we see, and cottontails are so cute. They're little butts with their little cotton tails. Anyway, back to this book. So there's the familiar, and it's adorable. And she has loved her life. Her life has been so nice, and she lives on this island that is it's kind of shrouded by a protective magical barrier that makes it so that nobody else can really find it. And there's kind of mysterious, interesting things on the island that she's supposed to avoid. But otherwise, it's kind of just a nice little paradise. But she's growing into an adult, and she realizes that she has no experience of the world beyond just the books that she reads and what Rowan, her guardian, tells her. And she wants to experience the world, as you would expect. So she is not content to just have the view outside her window. She wants to actually go outside, metaphorically speaking. So she finds an opportunity to do this one day when Rowan is coming back to the island, and he had something occur where he realizes like maybe we're actually in danger, and he ends up bringing her along in a plot to get to the bottom of this danger. And that then has her go on this almost like an adventure. She actually does experience some of our own world, because this does take place in our own world, minus the little island that's magical and the fact that there is magic in the story. So she's experiencing all the hardships. She's starting to see them and witness them for the first time, the hardships that so many people face, what it actually takes to live life when you don't just have everything on your magical little island. And it's really opening her eyes, and she's really rapidly changing, and she wants to be the kind of person that can do something about the hardships in the world and go up against those that are causing these things or who are making these things much worse. And so she, in her journeying, ends up having a lot of growth, and she also is finding out more about her guardian. And I think that that aspect of the story, it's kind of a mystery, because you do start to question, is Rowan as good of a person as she has always believed him to be? Her name is Biddy, by the way. That's her nickname. So is he really as lovely as he has seemed? Because he's always been lovely with her, but what has he done in his past? And how old is he really? And what has he done with his magic? And where are all the other magicians? And what are they doing with their magic? I really liked this one. I thought it has a hint of historical fiction, and I thought the way the historical fiction elements were done were fantastic. I just loved seeing the relationship between the characters progress. I liked seeing Biddy and her growth throughout the story. I liked getting to know what happened in the past and that little bit of mystery element that you get to the story. So I really, really liked this one. I think it's really accessible. I did a video recently with accessible adult fantasy books, and I started the video off with this one because I think it's obviously, being new, not as well known. But if you're looking to try adult fantasy and you're looking for something that feels like a little bit more familiar, it's not as much of a commitment, or it's not as daunting, this was great. I loved the writing style. I liked the narration of the audiobook. I loved the familiar. I just in general thought it was very, very good. Such a cozy, lovely fantasy story. So that's it. Very different books from book to book. These are all so drastically different. But if you have picked these up, definitely let me know what your thoughts were on these. And then if you are interested in picking them up, I'll have links in the description bar down below. Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.